Okay, when you picture Europe, you probably think of wealth, right? High standards of living, famous capitals. But what about Europe's poorest nation? Well, that title officially belongs to Moldova. Today, we're going to dig into what that label really means, and trust me, it's a lot more complicated than it sounds.
So, get this. This is a quote from a traveler right after they arrived in Moldova's capital. Because when you land there, the reality on the ground just doesn't quite match the stats. You see clean streets, beautiful architecture. It doesn't immediately scream poverty. So, what's the deal? Where does this whole poorest country label even come from?
Well, here's your answer. It's all about this massive economic gap inside Europe. Moldova's GDP per capita, which is basically a measure of what an average person's money can buy, is around $19,600. Now compare that to Europe's wealthiest nation, Luxembourg. It's over $150,000. That staggering difference is exactly where the label comes from. It's all relative to the rest of the continent.
But, numbers on a chart only tell you part of the story. So let's talk about what that economic data actually feels like in daily life, because this is where you start to see some really surprising contradictions.
Yeah, for anyone visiting, the capital Chisinau can feel like a total hidden gem. It's not just that it's beautiful, it is also incredibly cheap by European standards. I mean, you can get a fantastic meal and a coffee at a nice cafe for what, 10, 11 bucks? But here's the catch, that affordability is a real double-edged sword. For locals earning local wages, it's not cheap at all.
And that difference in perspective, it goes way beyond just money. To really get a feel for Moldova, you've got to understand the unwritten social rules, because these tell a much deeper story about the country's values and, frankly, its pain points.
Okay, so some of these are just about basic respect, right? Take your shoes off inside, pretty standard. But the others, they hinted something much deeper. Look at those last two. Don't ask why so many people are leaving, and never ever comment on the language. These are the two most sensitive, most painful issues in the country. Asking why people leave is a sore spot because, as one local said, we know what it's like living here. Let's unpack what that really means.
So, why are people leaving? Let's start with this number, 16%. What is that? Well, that's the slice of Moldova's entire economy that comes from remittances. That's money being sent home from Moldovans who've gone to work abroad in more stable places.
Just let that sink in for a minute. The country's economy is literally being propped up by the very people who've had to leave it. If that flow of money were to just stop, a fifth of the entire population would plunge into poverty overnight. It's why you see fewer working-age people around. They're working somewhere else, sending cash back to support the kids and parents they left behind.
So what's driving all this economic hardship and forcing so many people to leave? You ask the locals and you hear one word over and over again: corruption. This quote from a resident really gets to the heart of it. There's this deep feeling that corruption is everywhere, it's systemic, and it just chokes off opportunity, making a normal life incredibly difficult to build. But to really truly understand why Moldova is stuck in this situation, you have to look beyond the economy. You have to go deeper into its complicated history and this core question of its identity, which has been caught in a brutal tug-of-war between its powerful neighbors for centuries.
And this timeline just shows you how wild that history has been. For centuries, this land was part of a larger region that included a big chunk of modern-day Romania. Then it got passed back and forth between the Russian Empire and Romania. In 1940, it was forcibly swallowed up by the Soviet Union, which kicked off this intense period of Russification. This constant whiplash of borders and influence is absolutely key to understanding the deep divisions inside Moldova today.
And the thing is, the legacy of the Soviet Union isn't just something you read about in history books here. No, it is a living, breathing conflict that physically splits the country in two and basically holds its entire future hostage.
So let me introduce you to Transnistria. It's this skinny strip of land on the eastern side of the Dniester River. When the Soviet Union collapsed, this region, which has a huge Russian and Ukrainian-speaking population, got really worried that Moldova was going to reunite with Romania. So back in 1992, they just declared independence. Today, it basically operates like its own little country, a kind of Soviet theme park, totally frozen in time.
I'm not kidding. Transnistria has its own government, its own military, its own currency, its own constitution, and its flag is the only one in the world that still officially uses the Soviet hammer and sickle. The whole thing is propped up by Russia, which keeps so-called peacekeeper troops there. And what that really does is give Moscow a permanent foothold right inside Moldova's borders, creating this constant source of instability.
So you add all this up. The economic struggles, the identity crisis, this bizarre frozen conflict, and you get a country in an incredibly tough spot, caught right in the middle between East and West.
And you see this division play out every single day in their politics. The country is fundamentally split down the middle. Right now, the government is strongly pro-European. They want to join the EU. But the opposition, they're just as strongly pro-Russian and want to stay in Moscow's orbit. The whole society is torn about which way to go.
For Moldova's pro-European government, the road to the EU is full of massive roadblocks. For one, the EU is not going to welcome a new member that has Russian troops on its soil and a breakaway territory. But even beyond that, Moldova has to fix those deep, systemic problems we've been talking about, reforming its entire justice system, and, crucially, tackling that widespread corruption that's held it back for so long.
And that really is the central question for Moldova, isn't it? It's a nation whose people are literally building its economy from thousands of miles away, while back home, the country itself is being pulled apart by the competing gravity of Russia and Europe. Can it finally solve the frozen conflict within its own borders and escape the clutches of its history? Or is it just destined to be forever caught in the middle?